The collapse of the Soviet Union marked the end of Soviet-style communism and the beginning of a new world order. It marked the end of the Cold War and created over a dozen new democracies in Europe and Asia. And yet today, this event is taught very little in schools. I will cover the revolutions in the Warsaw Pact countries, and I will analyze the actual dissolution of the Soviet Union. To explain why the Soviet Union collapsed, we first need to talk about what the Soviet Union was. In its simplest form, the Soviet Union represented a dream of a communist utopia, where every person works towards the greater good, a dream in which people would live at an unprecedented level of prosperity, a dream of peace and freedom. But it never even came close to that dream. When measured against these lofty ideals the Soviet Union set for itself, it was an utter failure. It was an incredibly inefficient system smothered by a vast bureaucracy. A nation which butchered 10 million of its own citizens in its name, and created one of the most repressive and ruthless police states the world had ever seen. It started in 1917 in the Russian Empire. Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown in the Russian Revolution by a group known as the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were far-left revolutionaries. They were willing to try out a new ideology, an ideology called Marxism. This ideology was based on removing the class system, by controlling the wealth of a nation collectively, where society as a whole controls the means of production, thus removing the lower, middle and the upper classes in society. And this new Marxist country was officially founded in 1922, but rather than turning towards the communist dream, it instead turned towards dictatorship. Under the rule of Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union was slowly turned into a ruthless police state, where anyone even suspected of disloyalty could be sent to forced labor camps, as well as random people regardless of their loyalty. The leaders who would reign over the Soviet Union during its collapse were also the ones who grew up in Stalin's Soviet Union and experienced the cruelty of the regime firsthand. In the 1940s, the Soviet Union found itself at war with Germany. Last time I showed this map, a lot of people from Finland got angry that I included their country among the Axis powers, so to avoid any controversy this time, I'll just remove Finland. During this war, the Soviet Union conquered much of Eastern Europe. Some parts it annexed for itself. Other parts became satellite countries. These satellite countries were indirectly controlled through the Warsaw Pact. This pact was an agreement between the countries of East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and for a short time Albania. The Warsaw Pact was a complicated agreement between the countries, but in simple terms, the agreement guaranteed military support from the other nations in case of war, economic integration of the member states, and used the threat of invasion to make sure that all its member countries remained communist and loyal to the Soviet Union. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union and the United States of America became embroiled in a Cold War. This basically divided the world between the capitalist United States and its allies versus the communist Soviet Union and its allies. This division was personified in the Iron Curtain, a series of border walls and fences dividing Europe in two. When Stalin died in 1953, the new Soviet leaders decided to lift many of the most repressive policies. There were several reasons for this. The first was the moral argument. Most people thought that a system of forced labor camps, constant fear, and the abuse of power was morally wrong. The second argument was pragmatic. A system based on corruption, oppression, and loyalty was a lot less efficient. And so the Soviet Union released prisoners, removed many systems of oppression, and even renamed many places bearing the name of Stalin or Lenin. Under this process, people's lives became a little bit better. Their living standards improved, they were allowed to say and do more, and the economy became more efficient. But to many it didn't go far enough. The USSR, which is short for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which was the official name of the Soviet Union, the USSR was doing relatively well in terms of economic growth in the 1950s and 60s. But by the 70s and 80s, it was lagging behind. Its economy grew slowly, the leadership became averse to change, and some of the freedoms given were reversed. This meant that while the lives of people in capitalist societies were improving, such as Japan, West Germany and the United States, the lives of the people in the Soviet Union and its allies remained at a similar level as the 1960s. And in this moment of stagnation, in 1985, a new leader was elected to lead the Soviet Union. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev. He was from a new generation of Soviet leaders, being the first and last Soviet leader to be born in the Soviet Union. And by the time he took office, it was clear that the Soviet Union had become stagnant for far too long. Something needed to change, or else the entire system would slowly collapse. The first thing was its economy. The USSR's economy was a so-called command economy. In this system, many economic activities were planned centrally by the government, and the government prioritized the creation of machinery and large projects, while giving consumer goods, innovativeness and quality a much lower priority. At the same time, the Soviet Union was also incredibly inefficient. What would happen is that the government would set itself a goal, and then throw as many resources as was needed at the issue until they had the desired result. This meant that if a system was inefficient, it would receive more resources from the government to get the desired results. So basically, the less efficient a system, the more resources would be spent on it. On top of this inefficiency, the government also spent a lot of money on weapons to compete with the United States for the prestige of being a superpower, and sent money to various Soviet client states to prop up their economies with the aim of showing the world how great communism was as an ideology. And this latter part cannot be ignored. The Soviet leadership took policy not out of a pragmatic point of view of what worked and what didn't, but instead created policy based on ideology regardless of whether it worked or not. And this blatant disregard for reality caused the Soviet Union to implement policies which simply didn't work. As a result, the level of healthcare was notoriously bad, housing was shoddy, and people's diets were far less varied, all the while espousing how much better the Soviet citizens were doing compared to the rest of the world. The last leader of the Soviet Union explained the Soviet economy quite well. There is plenty of everything. Land, oil and gas, other natural resources, and God gave us lots of intelligence and talent, yet we live much worse than developed countries, and kept falling behind them more and more. The reasons could already be seen. The society was suffocating in the vice of the command bureaucratic system, doomed to serve ideology and bear the terrible burden of the arms race. This is in stark opposition to capitalism. Under a capitalist economy, there are many different independent production lines, leaderships and policies. Each business, each organization, each entrepreneur has to constantly compete with all the other ones in order to survive. If a company falls too far behind their competitor, then they will eventually go bankrupt and thus remove the least efficient actor from the economy, as long as a healthy capitalist economy is maintained. Gorbachev realized the state the Soviet Union was in and felt it was in drastic need of reform. He wanted the Soviet Union to finally realize that old communist dream, the dream of working towards the greater good, the dream of prosperity, the dream of freedom and peace. He felt that after Stalin, the Soviet Union should have given far more rights to the people and created a healthy communist system. Gorbachev wanted to end the secret police spying on people, feeling it was both immoral and a waste of resources. He wanted to give freedom of speech and freedom of the press, believing that criticizing the government would help the government to improve. And he wanted to end the tight grip on power at the top, instead letting local leaders solve local issues which they can do more effectively than a central government in Moscow. As Gorbachev's foreign minister said it best in 1984, "Everything is rotten. It has to be changed." But the new leadership did not believe that the communist system as a whole was a bad system. They thought that the system the Soviet Union used was a bastardization of communism, a bloated bureaucracy unable to serve the people it governed, and therefore wanted a communist government not based on fear and suppression, but a communist government based on serving the people. I am not ashamed to say that I am a communist and adhere to the communist idea. But change isn't easy, and there are always those who oppose it. So the first thing Gorbachev did to make change happen was to remove many government department heads from their position and replace them with people more open to change. Many of those open to change were of the new generation, like Gorbachev, well educated and were just as frustrated with the lack of reforms from the previous Soviet leaderships as he was. Some of those names you might even recognize, such as Boris Yeltsin, who would become the first president of the Russia we know today. One of the first things the new Soviet leadership did was to improve diplomatic relations with the rest of the world. This strategy had three goals in mind. First was to attract foreign investors. The Soviet Union had mostly been relying on its own resources, but as the Soviet economy lagged behind developed countries, they saw opening up as a great way to get foreign resources into the country to grow the economy. Secondly, the USSR could openly trade with the rest of the world. It could export its own products and resources to the outside world, which would improve the Soviet economy. And lastly, the Soviet Union wanted to improve diplomatic relations with their longtime rivals the United States of America and its allies in order to end the Cold War. This way, the Soviet Union could stop the expensive arms race and spend more resources on building up the country instead of building up arsenals. While the USA announced to increase military spending to fight the evil empire that was the Soviet Union, the USSR announced it would stop participating in the arms race and was going to withdraw its troops from foreign wars such as Afghanistan, and that it would reduce its military presence in its Eastern European client states. The second major policy was to reform the Soviet economy. This reform was called perestroika. This is a Russian word which means restructuring. What is often overlooked is that this restructuring wasn't a single policy. Rather, it was an overarching term for various complex economic policies undertaken from 1985 to 1991. But all these economic policies had one goal in mind: to increase the economic growth of the Soviet Union so its economy would become on par with that of Western economies. At first it only included minor changes, such as trying to bring foreign investments to the USSR. But by 1987, a policy was implemented to overhaul the entire Soviet economy. The plan was to transform the Union from a command economy to a mixed economy. What this meant was that rather than controlling all aspects of the economy from Moscow, some parts of the economy could be planned by local officials and by local businesses themselves. These changes included letting people own a portion of the businesses privately, instead of fully owned by the state. Businesses could set their own production targets based on demand. While they would still need to produce a minimum amount set by the government, they were allowed to produce more and sell those products for a profit. These businesses were allowed to determine their own prices instead of mandated prices by the government. Businesses became self-financing, meaning that they had to pay their own wages, supplies, etc. The government was no longer going to prop up failing businesses. and businesses would be owned by the workers instead of the government, giving employees of a business a stake in the operation of said business. And lastly, the government was no longer going to regulate detailed production plans for businesses. Instead, it would only set general guidelines and investment policies, and businesses were free to figure out the best way to run their production. But this was a mixed economy, not a fully capitalist economy. In the case of this new Soviet model, this meant that the so-called means of production, such as machinery, was still owned by the government. But the transition didn't go as smoothly as was hoped. This is because the Soviet economy relied on the central government too much, and it would take time to transition to the mixed economy. During this transition, the economy would perform a lot worse. But this transition wasn't expected to last too long, and that people would notice the improved economic conditions in just a few years. But that didn't happen, and there are many reasons why. The first is that the Soviet government didn't know how deeply mismanaged their economy actually was. In fact, the State Planning Commission didn't even have a model of how the economy functioned. It turned out that by no longer subsidizing so many failing businesses, even fewer products were available to people, as those businesses now needed to rethink how they were going to keep functioning. This led to shortages, so the government had to ration resources, which meant that there were long queues at stores that are often popularized in relation to communist economies. The second reason was that the government now earned less in tax revenue as the economy was slumping, while increasing spending on things such as pensions. This caused the government to have a huge budget deficit, spending 12% more than they earned in taxes, resulting in a government that was nearing bankruptcy. None of this would have been an issue if the USSR transitioned its economy fast enough. That way, it could have created a far more efficient economy that would have produced enough products and become highly competitive. That economy would then allow the government to earn more in taxes and thus allow the Soviet Union to spend more money on improving living standards. But this didn't happen. In his farewell address, Gorbachev explained that the old system collapsed before the new one had time to begin working. And aside from a shift in foreign policy and a shift in the economy, the Soviet Union also implemented a third large set of policies aimed at giving people more freedoms. This was called glasnost. This is a Russian word that means transparency. These policies included lifting the travel restrictions, meaning people could now travel to the West, allowed the publishing of previously banned books and movies, removing the tight grip of the omnipresent secret police, publishing secret documents about the Soviet Union concerning sensitive topics, such as the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, and lifting restrictions on freedom of speech and freedom of the press. These new policies caused a flood of new ideas, ideologies, and political movements to form across the Soviet Union. The Union was experiencing an intellectual renaissance. Aside from personal freedoms, glasnost also included political reform. The new Soviet leadership wanted a democratic Soviet Union. They did not believe that a communist country cannot also be a democratic country. In fact, many believed that the two were complementary, because if you need to answer to the will of the people every few years, then leaders would be held accountable for their actions to the same people they were ostensibly there to govern. And it is important to remember that the people of the Soviet Union and its communist allies were neither blind nor stupid. They were aware that they were being lied to. They saw that the propaganda they were shown conflicted with the reality of what they saw with their own eyes. But what they did not know was just how much they were being lied to. Until now. Because as glasnost flourished, people became more and more aware of the conditions in their country, while at the same time being allowed to criticize the government more and more. It was hoped that glasnost would spark a renewal in communist thinking. But instead, the combination of worsening living standards and greater freedom to criticize meant that people weren't thinking about improving communism, they were thinking about leaving communism. And as so often happens with the fall of empires, the trouble started at its fringes. Up until this point, everything had seemed relatively calm in the Soviet Union and its allies. People were gaining more freedoms, the government was actively trying to improve the prosperity of its citizens, and it appeared that a Cold War might actually end. There was a general feeling of hopefulness at this time. But then revolutions started popping up. The first was in Poland, in 1988, when people began protesting for workers' rights, such as legalizing trade unions. These trade unions then managed to bargain with the government to get freer elections in Poland, and as non-communist parties were now allowed to compete in elections, the trade unionists formed their own party, competed, and won the election on August 19, 1989, giving Poland its first non-communist government since World War II. The most important thing that the Soviet Union did during this Polish Revolution, however, was nothing. This wasn't the first time a Soviet satellite state underwent a revolution. In 1953, the Soviets put down protests in East Germany. In 1956, Hungary's revolution was crushed by Soviet forces. And in 1968, the Soviet Union, along with 4 other Warsaw Pact countries, invaded Czechoslovakia because they were becoming too liberal, such as giving freedom of speech. But now the Soviet Union didn't send in their troops. And this got people thinking. The next country to steer away from communism was Hungary. This country had always been one of the most liberal communist states. The Hungarians even had a saying for it. Hungary is the happiest barrack in the Eastern Bloc, which I'm told sounds even better in Hungarian. Mass demonstrations on March 15th of 1989 persuaded the Hungarian government to start negotiating with the new political parties that were forming in their country. These negotiations included an overhaul of the legal code, establishment of a constitutional court, and allowing free elections. Ironically, many of the people who are eroding Hungary's democracy at the moment were part of those negotiations. General elections were held on March 24, 1990, with Soviet forces ending their occupation a year later on June 19th. Just as with Poland, the Soviet Union did not take any overt action to stop Hungary. While in this process towards a freer society, the Hungarian government removed their border fence with Austria, opening the communist Hungarian border with the capitalist Austrian border, thus creating an opening in the Iron Curtain. For the first time in decades, people could now move relatively freely between the communist East and the capitalist West. Many people who lived in East Germany at the time took this opportunity and decided to cross the border to Austria and continue on to West Germany, where they were treated as full citizens. East Germany, which had the official name of the German Democratic Republic, or simply GDR, found these recent events in Hungary very troubling. In the 1950s, 3.5 million people fled to West Germany. In response, the GDR built the Berlin Wall around West Berlin, which was controlled by West Germany. But with this opening, many people tried to use it to flee to the West. And so the GDR closed its borders with fellow communist countries, leading to nationwide protests. Unlike in Hungary and Poland, these protesters were arrested and beaten by their own government. As more people were being abused, more people showed up to protest. The GDR was counting on Soviet troops coming to support their government. But they never came, and so, eventually, to appease the protesters, the borders were opened again, and the GDR decided to let people travel to West Berlin directly, in a few months. But at the press conference where they wanted to tell people about this new policy, the press secretary mistakenly told reporters that the border would be open immediately. The words were spoken, the people had listened, and the crowds gathered at the border checkpoints. As you can imagine, the border guards were more than a little confused when thousands of people showed up asking to pass through their checkpoint. With no instructions from their superiors, the guards relented and opened the gates to West Berlin. So many people wanted to travel back and forth that citizens took up chisel and hammer to open the wall themselves. And so, it was the Germans themselves who tore down that wall. With the fall of the wall, the process of German reunification was about to start, when both governments decided that Germany will be united. Free elections were held in January 1990, with German reunification occurring on the 3rd of October of that same year. If you want more information about German reunification process, you can watch my video on that topic by clicking on it at the end of this video. Next came Czechoslovakia with the Velvet Revolution. Czechoslovakia was the country which became the Czech Republic and Slovakia we know today. It started as a student protest on November 17th, 1989. This was suppressed by riot police. But, as usual, when the police beats down protesters, more protesters arrive. After one day, the protesters swelled to 200,000. After 2 days, they were 500,000. After a week, on November the 24th, the communist leadership resigned, and on November 28th, the government announced that free elections were to be held and the barbed wire would be removed from its borders. In just 11 days, the communist regime had effectively fallen. In June 1990, it held democratic elections, and in June 1991, the Soviet troops withdrew from their country. Bulgaria was late to the revolutionary parties that erupted around them. Demonstrations started in October and November, but were suppressed by their government. But the Bulgarian leadership had seen in which direction the tide of history was flowing. Rather than waiting for people to stage massive protests like everywhere else, the Bulgarian Politburo decided to oust their leader just a day after the Berlin Wall fell. He was replaced with a more liberal communist and repealed restrictions on free speech and assembly. But rather than preventing more protests, it led to the first mass demonstration on November 17th, 1989, and the formation of various anti-communist movements. These movements demanded even more freedoms, such as allowing multiple parties into the government. Negotiations were held in 1990, with elections in June that same year. The ruling Communist Party abandoned Marxist-Leninism, renamed itself the Bulgarian Socialist Party, and won the next election. And lastly came Romania. And unlike the other socialist states, the leader of Romania, a man named Nicolae Ceausescu, did not want to give up power. He appeared to want to wait until the anti-communist uprisings were over and he could continue ruling Romania. But in Romania too, communism wouldn't hold out. As with many protests, it started over something relatively small. A Hungarian Calvinist minister was arrested by the Romanian secret police on December 16th, 1989, because his sermons offended the regime. This caused riots and nationwide civil unrest. Ceausescu was in Iran at the time, and when he returned, he ordered a mass rally in his support on December the 21st. Here he addressed a crowd of 100,000 people, where he espoused the achievements of the socialist revolution. But only 2 minutes into his speech, people started chanting the name of the city in which this Hungarian minister was arrested. Ceausescu raised his right hand to silence the crowd, a tactic which had worked during his entire regime, but not this time. The people kept chanting, this right here, his stunned expression. This is the face of someone realizing that a revolution was unfolding against him, right in front of his eyes. The crowd booed and jeered at the man who only a week earlier controlled the country in an iron grip. Hundreds of protesters were shot. The next day the media reported that the defense minister had committed suicide. While this was actually correct, the military believed he had been executed, and the army switched sides. Ceausescu was captured, put on a mock trial, and was sentenced to death on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1989, only 9 days after the first riots. It was the bloodiest of the revolutions, with over 1,000 people dead. The youngest among them was only 1 month old. At the start of 1989, the Eastern European countries were all considered stable socialist countries. By the beginning of 1990, all Warsaw Pact nations had experienced a political revolution. Except the Soviet Union. It had thus far remained relatively stable, but 1990 was the year where this would change. It started with the Soviet Union allowing mostly free elections where people could vote for multiple parties, rather than only the communist parties. This allowed the various republics, which comprised the Soviet Union, to elect non-communist parties to their parliaments, resulting in a wide range of new parties being registered all over the Soviet Union. This was supposed to revitalize Soviet politics, believing that competition would result in a more efficient political system that would better represent the will of the people. What happened instead was that most people who were unhappy with the communist government voted en masse for independence movements. This was most prominent in Lithuania. A new political movement won most of the seats in their parliament as part of the Communist Party, and thus they practically took over the party in Lithuania and Lithuania's governance. The day after the elections, the new Lithuanian Assembly declared itself independent from the USSR. As a result, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics lost the Lithuanian Republic. But rather than sending in the Soviet army like so many countries would have done, the USSR decided to implement an economic embargo on Lithuania. The Soviet troops already present in Lithuania didn't intervene, but they didn't leave either. In those same elections, many other parts of the USSR also voted out the communist leaderships, such as Armenia, Estonia, Georgia, Latvia, and Moldova. Georgia declared independence on the 9th of April 1991, but the other four weren't declaring independence just yet. But by now people saw clearly that the Soviet Union really wasn't interfering. Not only did they let satellite countries erupt in protests, even within the regions of the Soviet Union there weren't a lot of crackdowns. Neither Lithuania nor the other 5 non-communist governments faced any military reprisal from the USSR. And as more and more people noticed that rebellions passed without a major backlash, more and more people started a rebellion of their own. One region after the other erupted in rebellion, such as Azerbaijan, where the people destroyed fences and watchtowers along the border with Iran and overthrew the government in one town. Although here the Soviet army did violently crack down on protesters, which alienated the local communists and led them to unsuccessfully declare their own independence. Ukraine erupted in peaceful protests in the beginning of 1990. While the government did oblige the local population, such as decriminalizing certain religious practices. In their elections, people voted for new democratic parties. Tensions slowly rose with the Soviet leadership, as Ukraine recalled all of its soldiers fighting in Soviet conflicts, declared its economic sovereignty, and declared its goal of independence, among many other things. While not officially independent, they were clearly on track to do so. In Tajikistan, protests turned violent as people torched government buildings, shops, and businesses amidst a call for economic and political reform. In Kyrgyzstan, ethnic national groups clashed with each other over the division of land from former collective farms, which were now being privatized. 300 people died. With the fringes of the Soviet Union becoming less unified, the USSR desperately tried to keep the country together. To speed up the economic growth of the Union, they launched the 500 Days program, which sought to reinvigorate the Soviet Union to show the people and governments of the Union that the USSR was worth keeping around. This plan was meant to create the groundwork for transitioning the economy to become more competitive. They would create a competitive market similar to capitalism, with mass privatization of businesses, stop controlling the prices of products, join the global economy, and to transfer even more power away from the centralized governments and towards the local republics. As part of this, a second initiative was to wholly transform the Soviet Union away from centralization and oppression and towards a federation, where every region was given equal rights and equal say in the affairs of the Union, and where every person, regardless of ethnicity or creed, were given equal rights. It was hoped that the people would no longer protest for independence, as a federation would allow each part to govern mostly independently. And to make sure that the people felt that they had a say in the matter, the Soviet Union decided to ask its people if this was what they wanted. They held a nationwide referendum on March 17, 1991. The referendum asked people, do you consider it necessary to preserve the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic as a renewed federation of equal sovereign republics, which will fully guarantee the rights and freedoms of all nationalities? While the referendum was boycotted in some regions, almost 150 million people showed up to vote. Over 75% of people voted in favor of turning the Soviet Union into a federation. This wasn't the only referendum taking place that day, with various regions adding questions on whether they should become independent. Russia, for example, added a question about whether they wanted to have a president representing the Russian part of the Soviet Union. The Russian people agreed, and in June 1991, Boris Yeltsin became the first president of Russia. By now, the Soviet Union was facing separatism across the nation and was ready to hand over power to the various regions of the USSR, and this was going to go into effect on August 20th, with the signing of the new Union Treaty, which would turn the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics into the Union of Sovereign States. This would hopefully keep the Union together, but there were many in the government who didn't like this idea at all. From the defense minister, to the vice president, to the head of the Soviet secret police. And so they tried to take over the government in a coup to bring back the unity of the USSR. Their goals were to remove Gorbachev from power, return centralized power back to Moscow, and to use military force to keep the Soviet Union together. Gorbachev was on holiday, so the rebellious army put him under holiday house arrest. They announced the end of free press and sent the army to take over government buildings. The coup organizers expected massive popular support from the people, expecting to be hailed as saviors of the USSR. And people did come out in droves, but rather than supporting the coup, they tried to stop it. When tanks drove towards the Russian parliament building, people far braver than I surrounded the tanks, creating a human barricade until the tanks could no longer move without crushing the very people whose support they needed. President Boris Yeltsin raced to the parliament building where he met with the pro-reform protesters, climbed atop the tank and held a speech condemning the revolution. By August 21st, only 2 days later, the revolution had clearly failed. But so had the attempt at turning the USSR into a federation. With the coup, many people across the USSR felt that Moscow wasn't able to govern them anymore and were no longer interested in preserving the Soviet Union in any form. From this moment forward, one region after the other would declare their independence from the Soviet Union. This was the last proverbial drop in the bucket that made the house of cards crumble. The first was Estonia, who declared their independence on the second day of the coup on August the 20th. Then came Latvia a day later. Then Ukraine on the 24th. Belarus declared independence on the 25th. Moldova the 27th. Kyrgyzstan the 31st. Uzbekistan on September the 1st. Tajikistan on the 9th. Armenia on the 21st. Azerbaijan on October the 18th. Turkmenistan on October the 27th. Russia on December the 12th, and Kazakhstan on December the 16th. These countries, along with several regions which today are incorporated into other countries, declared their independence until there was almost nothing left of the Soviet Union. And so, with every part of the Soviet Union declaring their independence, it was decided that the USSR was going to be dissolved. The Soviet Union was officially declared dead on December 26, 1991, at the age of 69. There were no grand ceremonies, no parades. Gorbachev had a short speech expressing sorrow over the fall of the Union, frustrations of past mistakes, and hope for a better and freer people. After that speech, General Secretary Gorbachev resigned from his post. He possessed a quality lacking in most world leaders. He knew when to quit. Later opinion polls showed that the Soviet people felt it was time for him to move on. Not because they thought he had failed, but because he had served his purpose. Under his leadership, the yoke of totalitarian dictatorship had been lifted, even if in many of those countries that yoke would return just a few years later. And so ended the Soviet Union.
Уважаемое Федеральное собрание, уважаемые граждане России. В послании 2005 года затронул ряд принципиальных идеологических и политических вопросов. Считаю, что на данном этапе развития России такой разговор необходим. Самые актуальные из стоящих перед нами социально-экономических задач, включая конкретные национальные проекты, были названы еще в предыдущем послании. Намерен развивать их и в бюджетном послании, а также в ряде других документов. При этом прошу рассматривать прошлогоднее и нынешнее послание Федеральному собранию как единую программу действий, как нашу совместную программу на ближайшее десятилетие. Главной политико-идеологической задачей считаю развитие России как свободного демократического государства. Мы довольно часто произносим эти слова, однако глубинный смысл ценностей свободы и демократии, справедливости и законности в их практическом преломлении в нашей жизни раскрываем достаточно редко. Между тем, потребность в таком анализе есть. Идущие в России объективно непростые процессы все больше и больше становятся предметом активных идеологических дискуссий. И они связываются именно с разговорами о свободе и демократии. Порой можно слышать, что поскольку российский народ веками безмолвствовал, то и свобода для него якобы непривычна и не нужна. И будто бы поэтому наши граждане нуждаются в постоянном начальственном присмотре. Хотел бы вернуть тех, кто так считает, к реальности, к тому, что есть на самом деле. Для этого еще раз напомню, как зарождалась новейшая российская история. Прежде всего следует признать, и об этом я уже говорил, что крушение Советского Союза было крупнейшей геополитической катастрофой века. Для российского же народа оно стало настоящей драмой. Десятки миллионов наших сограждан и соотечественников оказались за пределами российской территории. Эпидемия распада, к тому же, перекинулась на саму Россию. Накопления граждан были обесценены, старые идеалы разрушены. Многие учреждения распущены или реформировались просто на скорую руку. Целостность страны оказалась нарушена террористической интервенцией и последовавшей хасавюртовской капитуляцией. Олигархические группировки, обладая неограниченным контролем над информационными потоками, обслуживали исключительно собственные, корпоративные интересы. Массовая бедность стала восприниматься как норма. И все это происходило на фоне тяжелейшего экономического спада, нестабильных финансов, паралича социальной сферы. Многие тогда думали, многим казалось, что наша молодая демократия является не продолжением российской государственности, а ее окончательным крахом, является затянувшейся агонией советской системы. Те, кто так думали, ошиблись.
The breakup of the Soviet Union USSR or CCCP symbolized as the Red Beast Empire or power as predicted in Revelation 17 verse 8. Look at this map. Before 1992, the Red Beast was, or existed prior to this date, December the 25th, 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. After the 26th of December 1991, the Red Beast is not, meaning that it has died or is dead and no longer exists, but yet is, from the Greek parastai or is present or alongside it in name only, as the CIS or Commonwealth of Independent States which had replaced it. How accurate was Christ's prophecies to the Apostle John in the book of Revelation about this red Antichrist beast empire which was, and is not and yet is? The BELAVEZHA Accord or treaty that apparently killed the Red Beast of the Soviet Union in 1991 temporarily. It was first signed by 3 former socialist republics of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia on the 8th of December 1991 at the Vyshkili government house in the Belarusian national park named the BELAVEZHA Pushcha Natural Reserve or Forest in Belarus, spearheaded by Russian President Boris Yeltsin with Leonid Kravchuk, President of the SSR Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine, and Stanislav Shushkevich, the chairman of the Supreme Council of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Belarus. The Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, is a regional intergovernmental organization in Eastern Europe and Asia. It was formed following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. It covers an area of 20,368,759 square kilometers, 7,864,422 square miles, and has an estimated population of 239,796,010. The CIS encourages cooperation in economic, political, and military affairs and has certain powers relating to the coordination of trade, finance, lawmaking, and security. It has also promoted cooperation on cross-border crime prevention. The CIS has its origins with the Russian Empire, which was replaced in 1917 by the Russian Republic after the February Revolution earlier that year. Following the October Revolution, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic became the leading republic in the Soviet Union, USSR, upon its creation with the 1922 Treaty and Declaration of the creation of the USSR along with Belarusian SSR, Ukrainian SSR, and Transcaucasian SFSR. When the USSR began to fall in 1991, the founding republics signed the BELAVEZHA Accords on the 8th of December 1991, declaring that the Soviet Union would cease to exist and proclaimed the CIS in its place. A few days later the ALMA-ATA Protocol was signed, which declared that the Soviet Union was dissolved. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which regard their membership in the Soviet Union as an illegal occupation, chose not to participate. Georgia withdrew its membership in 2008 following the Russo-Georgian War. Ukraine ended its participation in CIS statutory bodies in 2018, due to prolonged tensions with Russia. 8 of the 9 CIS member states participate in the CIS Free Trade Area. 3 organizations originated from the CIS, namely the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, alongside subdivisions, the Eurasian Customs Union and the Eurasian Economic Space, and the Union State. While the first and the second are military and economic alliances, the third aims to reach a supranational union of Russia and Belarus with a common government, flag, currency, and so on. In March 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev, the president of the Soviet Union, proposed a federation by holding a referendum to preserve the Union as a union of sovereign republics. The new treaty signing never happened as the Communist Party hardliners staged an attempted coup in August that year. Often considered as the successors of the USSR, it is one of the largest intergovernmental organizations in Europe. Following the events of August's failed coup, the republics of the USSR had declared their independence fearing another coup. A week after the Ukrainian independence referendum was held, which kept the chances of the Soviet Union staying together low, the Commonwealth of Independent States was founded in its place on the 8th of December 1991 by the Belarusian SSR, the Russian SFSR, and the Ukrainian SSR, when the leaders of the three republics met at the BELAVEZHA Pushcha Natural Reserve, about 50 kilometers, 31 miles, north of Brest in Belarus, and signed their agreement establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States, known as the Creation Agreement, Russian, Soglasheny. The CIS announced that the new organization would be open to all republics of the former Soviet Union, and to other nations sharing the same goals. The CIS charter stated that all the members were sovereign and independent nations and thereby effectively abolished the Soviet Union. On the 21st of December 1991, the leaders of 8 additional former Soviet republics, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, signed the ALMA-ATA protocol, which can either be interpreted as expanding the CIS to these states or the proper foundation or foundation date of the CIS, thus bringing the number of participating countries to 11. Georgia joined 2 years later, in December 1993. At this point, 12 of the 15 former Soviet republics participated in the CIS. The 3 Baltic states did not, reflecting their governments and people's view that the post-1940 Soviet occupation of their territory was illegitimate. The CIS and Soviet Union also legally coexisted briefly with each other until the 26th of December 1991, when the Soviet of the republics formally dissolved the Soviet Union. This was followed by Ivan Korochenya becoming executive secretary of the CIS on the same day. Thus we saw the red beast predicted in the book of Revelation 17 verse 8 identified today as the ex-Soviet Union of the Socialist Republics, with Russia as the head was and is not, has died and yet is present as the Commonwealth of Independent States of 9 remaining ex-Socialist Communist republics excluding Ukraine and Moldavia. Both were founding member states which had withdrawn together with Georgia and the 3 Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which did not join the CIS in 1991 too. The present. According to Bible prophecies, the red beast will yet leave again after it is reformed and revived by the CPRF, or Communist Party of the Russian Federation, founded by 4 times presidential hopeful, Mr. Gennady Zyuganov, a communist hardliner probably in concert with other leftist socialist or communist parties, a CCCP 2.0 or USSR 2.0, after having emerged out of the abyss as a revived red beast that will be alongside, before it is ignominiously killed and destroyed by the glorious second coming of Christ to set up God's kingdom on the earth. The ALMA-ATA protocol, signed on the 21st of December 1991, has by now expanded and joined in by 8 more ex-Soviet or CIS leaders like Kazakhstan President Nursultan Nazarbayev, except Georgia, besides the first 3, which was President Yeltsin for Russia, Chairman of the Supreme Council of Belarus, Stanislav Shushkevich for Belarus, and President Leonid Kravchuk for Ukraine at the BELAVEZHA Accord in Belarus on the 8th of December 1991. Nine Commonwealth of Independent States, or the CIS, represented by its logo here, was first formed from 3 member states, Russia, Belarus and Ukraine, on the 8th of December 1991, then expanded to 12, and finally down to 9 ex-Soviet Socialist republics. This was done at the signing of the ALMA-ATA protocol on the 21st of December, 4 days just before the collapse of the Soviet Union on the 25th of December 1991, when the last president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, resigned quietly without a fight, though broadcasted by Russian TV to the whole world. They are 1. Russia, 2. Armenia, 3. Azerbaijan, 4. Belarus, 5. Moldova, 6. Kyrgyzstan, 7. Uzbekistan, 8. Tajikistan, and 9. Kazakhstan. Number 10 member states Georgia did not sign, and number 11, Ukraine, though a founding member state, both due to their differences with Russia, withdrew later, as did number 5 Moldova. The 12th, Turkmenistan, joined in as an associated non-member state. Mongolia and Afghanistan, both joined as observer states only. The 3 ex-Soviet Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, never joined but declared their own independence from the USSR and consequently from the CIS also after its formation in 1991 to 1993. The emblems and nations of the 9 full members of Commonwealth of Independent States. A historic group photo taken at the summit of the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS's Council of Heads of State in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, in 2008. Standing from left to right representing their flags are Sergei Labeev, the Executive Secretary of the CIS, and all the 11 constituent presidents of Azerbaijan, Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Russia, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Ukraine. Number 10, Georgia, which was a member state, withdrew its membership by 2008 because of its war with Russia and so is not represented here. Similarly, number 5, Moldova, due to its differences with Moscow, and number 11, Ukraine, which withdrew later due to Russia's annexation of Crimea and her resulting civil war with Russia in the Donbass region. A group photo of the 9 defense ministers of the CIS meeting in Moscow on the 26th of May 2017, standing before their national flags. From left to right are 2 men representing the CIS, the Executive Secretary and his Chief Minister of Defense, followed by the various Ministers of Defense of Azerbaijan, Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, which joined as an associate, non-member state, and Uzbekistan. They were from left to right: Colonel General Zakir Hazanov, Mr. Surin Parpikian, Lieutenant General Viktor Krenin, Commander-in-Chief Murat Bektanov, Major General Baktibek Bekbolatov, Army General Sergei Shoigu, Colonel General Shiali Matso, and Lieutenant General Bakadir Kurbanov. Turkmenistan is an associate non-member state. Notice that number 5, Moldova, which was represented in the CIS official logo, number 10, Georgia, and number 11, Ukraine, not in the logo, had withdrawn from the CIS organization by now in May 2017. Notice the faint outline of the Imperial Roman Russian double-headed eagle over the western and eastern part of the globe on the whitewashed wall background behind them, which can still be seen. Another photo of all the members of the Defense Council of the CIS in a Moscow summit in 2017. Standing from left to right with their national flags behind them were 1. Azerbaijan, 2. Armenia, 3. Belarus, 4. Kazakhstan, the CIS Executive Secretary standing at the center, followed by 5. Russia, 6. Kyrgyzstan, 7. Tajikistan, and the 8. Uzbekistan. The defense ministers of Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine were not represented here in this photo because they have withdrawn by now in 2017, is no longer a CIS member state, or like number 9 here, Turkmenistan is an associate, non-member only. Now notice again the unmistakable Imperial Russian Roman double-headed eagle mounted on the wall behind them in this government building in Moscow, revealing that the CIS is but a continuation from the Soviet Union, the red beast which was and is not and yet is present and is connected to the Russian Empire from the past via the Greek Byzantine Empire or Eastern Roman Empire back to Rome, Italy. For the Roman Aquila or eagle have been adopted by the Second or New Rome, Constantinople, and then when it fell in 1453 by the Third Rome, Moscow, the capital of Imperial Russia and thus by extension to representing all of Rus or Russia as their national emblems. The red beast which was, and is not, and yet is, and will be present soon by arising out of the abyss and is going into destruction as predicted in Revelation 17 verse 8, that the inhabitants of the earth, those whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the earth will wonder or be amazed, when they see the red beast's end-time empire led by a supreme Soviet socialist communist dictator, predicted as Gog from the land of Magog by the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 38 and 39. The red beast that was, is not, and yet is present, or is revived as USSR 2.0 or CCCP 2.0 after it has emerged out of the abyss to be worshipped by all unsaved mankind except the godly saints, the elect of God who knows and understands this Bible prophecy in Revelation 17 and 18 and will refuse to take his mark or name or number 666 even on the pains of death by beheading. The next Russian leader after the alleged death of the Red Beast on the 26th of December 1991 was President Boris Yeltsin, who ruled Russia and the CIS from July 1991 to December 1999 for 8 years. He was succeeded by President Vladimir Putin, who ruled for 4 years from May 2000 to May 2004 in his first term and then from May 2004 to May 2008 in his second term before he stepped down for his deputy president Dmitry Medvedev to be president of Russia from May 2008 to May 2012 while he remained as the prime minister, calling all the shots with Medvedev as his puppet. Then after winning the third presidential elections in 2012, he ruled again as president of Russia from May 2012 to May 2018 for another 6 years. He stood again for the 2018 election for the fourth time, won it and ruled from May 2018 to the present May 2022 until his 6-year term ends in May 2024. But will he be ousted by another military coup d'etat by other disgruntled Kremlin communist hardliners who attempted to remove President Gorbachev in August 1991 but failed? Or will he be defeated at the polls by his political opponents, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, CPRF, led by Mr. Gennady Zyuganov and other leftist communist parties now that the crazy leader of the Liberal Democratic Party of the Russia, LDPR, a fascist political party formerly led by the late ultra-nationalist Vladimir Zhirinovsky has died of COVID-19 on the 6th of April 2022 after having been hospitalized in early February 2022. More serious political intrigues and now with less antics in the Russian Duma still remains to be seen. This could happen because of Putin's failed invasion of Ukraine and inability of the Russian forces to capture Kyiv, its capital, on the 24th of February 2022. Now in its fourth month resulted in great economic problems, massive food shortages on the masses and his failure to keep the Russian economy afloat in the midst of multiple economic sanctions by the West. So be on a red alert, saints. Keep on watching the rise, prowess and actions of the allegedly killed or deaf but actually hibernating red Russian bear which may soon wake up from its decades winter nap soon.